Hello there, it's Juliana Michaels and welcome to my channel. In this video, I'm sharing two vintage grungy Christmas cards that are perfect for mass production. If you need to make multiples this holiday season, I'm going to show you how to use compartmental making to batch your steps and work smarter, not harder. Plus, I'm going to show you two different complexity levels. One card that's a bit more involved with layered techniques, and another one that gives you a similar look with fewer steps and less time. Both cards feature that moody textured aesthetic we love with vintage typewriters and holiday greenery. Now let's get into it. The stamps and stencils and dies that I'm going to be working with for this card are from Timholtz, and they are Curiosity Shop, Music and Advert, and Home for Christmas. And specifically, I'm going to be using the typewriter and this little piece of paper here. And then I'm going to use the little holly leaf and the pine cone and this pine branch, and then these Christmas sentiments. So kind of mixing and matching these two. This is going to be used for the background stamps. So you could switch this out. Any of these could be switched out, of course, because these are just going to be like embellishments and background stamping. And then I'm also going to be using the coordinating dies that go with the stamp sets, and these are only available at Simon Says Stamp. And then the stencil that I'm going to be working with is the Sparkle Fade from the mini set 62, but you could use the larger one if you wanted, or any stencil for that matter. For the mediums, I'm going to be working with some distress inks. I've got frayed burlap, old paper, walnut stain, aged mahogany, and rustic wilderness for the distress inks. You could switch these out for oxide inks if you wanted. I'm also going to be using some archival ink in rustic wilderness, black soot, and vintage photo. And I've got some sprays that I'm going to be working with. I've got the distress spray stain, and then I'm going to be using the rustic wilderness distress spritz, or you could also maybe use the mica stain tree lot. These are just going to be used for splattering, so if you don't have the spritzes, you could totally leave these off and do splatters with something else. And then I'm going to be using some grit paste translucent and this Seth Apter Wow embossing powder called Etched Platinum, and it's kind of like a platinum color, but then it's also got these little specks of like black mixed in there with it, so it gives it a really cool grungy effect. And then lastly, I'm going to be using some distress watercolor cardstock for all of the stamping and the backgrounds. So the first thing I'm going to do is take one of the background stamps here, so I'm going to use this Advert stamp, and just going to place it, kind of center it onto my background here, and just going to kind of use these magnets to help hold that in place. And I'm just going to stamp that with some archival ink and vintage photo, but you could use any kind of permanent ink that you like, but because we're going to be doing some other mediums on top of this, I wanted to use a permanent ink so that it won't bleed or fade or anything. So, if you can stamp this a couple times, if you want to get a really good dark impression, just depends on maybe how fresh your ink pad is. The next thing we're going to do is add some spray stain over the top of this. So I've got the walnut stain, and I'm just working here on my splat box so that that kind of captures the spray so it's not so hard to clean up. And then I've got some paper towel on the bottom here to soak up any extra. And I'm just going to give a few squirts here and there, and then add some water to kind of get that flowing. If you like kind of more of that speckledy look, you can keep it like it is, or you can add a little more water to kind of make it flow and smooth that out a little bit more. Just kind of a personal preference there. And then I'm going to use a heat tool to dry that. And you can kind of just pick it up and tap it a little bit here, kind of get the ink flowing around, dab off some of the excess if you need to. So as far as the compartmental making goes, you could have all your card panels cut, and then you could do all your stamping. Then the next step you could do is the sprays. Anytime you're working with any of these types of sprays that have the mica in the bottom, you just want to make sure you shake them up really well and get all that mixed in real good. So then the next step here I'm going to do is just add a little misting of the Rustic Wilderness. And so this will just give it a little slight greenish sparkle. So just this comes out in a kind of a fine mist. So it's not going to give it like full coverage or anything. And it will come out in these like little splatters, which is intentional. So it's just going to be a very, very light shimmer that's going to come from that. And then you can just give that a quick dry. And the shimmer will come out even more once it's dry. And if you wanted to do, you know, some more splatters, you could add in some splatters with the spritz, which is pretty minimal. Another option you could do, if you just want to add some splatters, you could use like your like a mica stain or some other kind of spray that you might have. You could just tap it on and create little splatters like that. And then again, of course, just give that a dry or let it dry on its own. I wouldn't recommend using the mica stain as an all-over spray though, because it's probably going to cover up most of that walnut stain that we sprayed on there. So just a little heads up, if you're going to try to do any kind of spraying with any of like the mica stains or spritz, I would use spritz to spray with and the mica stain to do maybe more splatters with. So here's a little look at some of the shimmer that we got from the sprays and doing the spray and the splatter. And the mica stain does take a little bit longer to dry. So if it's not drying right away, just give it some time or use your heat tool. But if like the bigger splatters will take a little bit longer to dry before they'll stop wiping off on your fingers. So just something to kind of keep in mind there. So then while the paste is drying, or if you want to do this as a separate step in your compartmental making, you can do your stamping. So I'm just going to do the stamping for the typewriter and the little piece of paper here. And then I'm also going to stamp some of these other smaller images that are going to be used to kind of add to the embellishments on the card. And I'm going to stamp these with archival ink because I'm going to add some color to some of them. Oh, that one didn't pick up. Add some color to them using some watercolor and inking. So again, I don't want the colors to bleed when I do that. And I'll stamp that a couple times here just to get a good, nice, dark impression with all of them. There we go. And then for the pine branch, just because of the way this is designed, I ended up stamping it just in the green archival ink because it's not really so much of an outline. It could be done in black too, but I kind of liked the look it gave to stamp it in the green. And I'm going to repeat stamp several of the pine branches and the pine cones just so that I have several of them for the card. So I'm going to stamp 3 pine cones and 4 of the pine branches. All right, so we've got our stamping completed. And then at this point, we're going to add some color to these images using some Distress oxide colors. Now, of course, you could also color these like with watercolor pencils or whatever else you might want to color them with. And I'm just going to use a water brush. You could use a paintbrush with a little bit of water to do the same thing. So I'm just going to smush that ink pad onto my craft mat here and then use my water brush to pick up some of that ink and kind of turn it into a paint. And then can use that to watercolor my images. Yeah. And we can just give that a quick dry. And then we're going to do the same thing with the aged mahogany. I'm going to use this for the berries. And then we're going to do the walnut stain for the pine cones. And I'm just loosey-goosey coloring these. It's not going for anything perfect or anything like that here. Just get some color onto them. And so, of course, this entire step here could be part of your compartmental stuff. So you could do all the stamping, have everything stamped out, ready to go. You know, if you're using a stamping platform, you can just shift, put new pieces of paper in and stamp all the typewriters and then all of the paper and then all the holly leaves and all the pine cones, and each, kind of do each one at a time. And then you could do your coloring next. And so that would be another step. So you can just, again, another way to kind of break everything up. And then lastly, we're going to make our paper look old. So I'm going to add some old paper here, and I'm going to get a generous amount of water flowing onto this and just kind of loosely paint over that image with that color and give that a dry. I just realized I forgot to stamp my sentiment here, but you could do the sentiment stamping before you do the inking that I just did. So let's do that real quick here, and let's do Joy to the World. Kind of go up kind of towards what I'm going to have as the top of my paper. And I'm going to stamp that with the archival ink. So you definitely want to use the archival ink here, just like you did with any of the other ones that you colored, so that the ink doesn't run if you use any kind of a water reactive colorant, such as the inks or watercolor pencils or whatever you want to do to add your color to things. And then from here, if you have the dies, then that's the next step, is to do all of the die cutting. So if you don't have the dies, you could also fussy cut these, or for that matter, maybe you use the typewriter and use some die cuts for, maybe you got some other like Christmas die cuts that are already maybe easier to put together or cut out, that are pine cones and pine branches and a holly thing that you could put on here with the typewriter. So just some options to think about when you're going through your stash and looking for things. So don't feel like you need to have everything exactly the same as what I'm doing here. So now I'm just going to go and do my die cutting. All right, so at this point our paste is pretty dry. So I am going to take my heat tool and heat emboss this paste. Now, a couple tips when you are heat embossing over the paste. It is going to bubble a little bit because it's paste. So, don't worry about that. But the main thing you want to do is just keep that heat tool moving and don't hold it in one place for too long. And then also too, like if you don't have the paste and you still want to get this effect, you could also just use embossing ink through the stencil and apply the embossing powder over that. The paste just adds some texture, as you can see here. So it just adds a little bit more dimension and texture to the background. So I have my die cutting done, and one thing that is cool about this little typewriter die is it has like a slot cut into it so that the little paper piece like fits down in there kind of perfectly. So that part's kind of cool. And then with that said, what I want to do is add just a little bit of that old world to this part of the typewriter so that it kind of blends in with my little piece of paper here. So let's give that a quick dry. And then the other thing I'm going to do is just ink the edges of these little die cuts a little bit, because I just feel like they're just a little too pretty and white for the look I'm going for. So obviously I'm going for a little bit of a distressed effect, so I'm even going to add a little ink in there and just ink around the edges of all these. And then from here, it's really just a matter of assembling all these pieces. So you can tuck your little paper down in there, and just use a little bit of adhesive here on the back to hold that in place. And then for the rest of it, I will probably use like some foam squares just to pop everything up, and layer all these pieces together here. So I'm going to put the little pine branch or holly, like right there, and then for these, I'm just going to tuck them behind. I'm kind of thinking too, like how much of it's going to fill up the background there. And so I'm going to just put some foam adhesive on the back side of the typewriter here. I'm just going to use some bigger pieces of that. And like I said, just kind of figure out where you want to have your little branches sticking up, and maybe pop these up as well. So I'm just going to peel that off, and now if there's getting too much kind of layered up there in the middle, you can always kind of trim off some of this length on those, because you don't need it. It's going to be covered up anyway. So that cuts down a little bit on some of that bulk as well. Go. You can also kind of lay it over on top of your background as well, just to kind of help make sure you're not having anything sticking out too far. And then from there, you can just tuck your little pine cones in here and there. And if you had any other extra greenery pieces that you maybe don't want to throw out or whatever, you could tuck those in. And then then from here, it's just a matter of adding a little bit more adhesive here on the back to adhere it to the background. Usually you're going to need some pretty good adhesive to adhere to the texture paste, so whatever sort of stronger adhesive that you like to use. And then you can just stick that onto your background there. And you know, if you want to trim the background, mat it onto another color of cardstock, I'm going to trim this down to 4 by 5 1/4 inches and mat it onto a piece of black cardstock to finish off the card. So the first thing we're going to do is take the piece of distressed watercolor cardstock and some old paper distress ink, and I'm just going to smush that down onto my craft mat and spritz that with a little water. If that's not enough, you can always add more. And then I'm just going to kind of dab my paper into the ink. I'm putting the ink onto the smooth side of the distressed watercolor cardstock, and then just going to give this a quick dry. If you want to make this more intense or a little bit darker or add more interest to this, you can repeat that ink smushing. So you just smush that down again, another spritz, and then kind of dip into that ink again here and there. So I'm not wiping through, I'm kind of using my fingers to kind of pick certain areas where I want to try to pick up the ink. And then we'll just give that another dry. All right, so then the next step we're going to do is we're going to add a little bit of some stamping. So I'm going to use the music stamp from that same stamp set that I used on the other card, and I'm going to add a little bit of some temporary adhesive here on the back of this just to kind of help hold it in place. And because you can see the magnets don't really have a lot of area to hold on to here with that stamp. Do the best we can here. All right, now normally I stamp with archival ink because I don't want it to run or bleed or anything like that. But this time we are gonna stamp with some distress ink, and I'm gonna use some frayed burlap. I'm just going to apply that to the stamp here. And I'm kind of going for a little bit more of a watercolory effect or faded, distressed effect. So now I'm going to spritz this with a little water. It's a few times there, just kind of a light mist. And now I'm going to stamp that over onto my paper here. Just kind of hold it for a second. There we go. Now if you want it a little more runny, you can spritz this again, close it over it, and there we go. And then we'll just give that a dry. So kind of some of it is really, a little more crisp, and other areas are a little bit more kind of faded and distressed, and just adds some interest to the background. But because I'm not going to be doing any more spraying or spritzing or anything, I'm not applying any other wet mediums on top of this. That's why I am okay with it doing this, and so it just gives it a different look as well. So now what we're going to do is we're going to stamp our greenery. Now on the first card, we stamped and die cut everything, but on this one I'm going to actually stamp the greenery onto the background paper here. So it kind of saves a step when it comes to the die cutting. Now I have already off camera stamped and die cut all of my pine cones and typewriter and the sentiment and the little berries, and I'm just going to kind of be thinking again about having them on my card here and where maybe they would be. So I want to have this in the center, and then pick that up. And this time I am going to use the archival ink here. You don't have to, but it'll just give it a little bit more crisp stamped image. Let's stamp that a couple times here so that you can see that it really shows up nicely, especially with this darker green color. And I'm going to clean it off in between just to make sure I don't accidentally stamp it down. I'm going to get ink somewhere maybe that I don't want it. So again, just kind of playing around here with about where I would maybe want that branch sticking out from behind the typewriter. And just re-ink and stamp. And it doesn't matter about having it perfect in the middle there, because again, that's going to be all covered up. And just like with that first card, you know, you can kind of do the different steps of this as compartmental making. So, you know, so you could ink smush all your backgrounds, and then you could do the stamping with the background stamp, and then you could do the typewriter and die cuts and all that, and then you could do the greenery. So it just, you know, break it up into steps, and especially if you're wanting to make multiples of the same card, just breaking it up and doing the same pieces of it over and over and over again. Just kind of a way to sit down, get some of it done, but not feel like you have to sit down and make all of one card all at the same time. You kind of just break it up and kind of break it up into doable chunks, you know. So yeah, so there. And then from here, again, I would add some foam tape onto the back side of all of these. And then just, you know, adhere everything down. And, you know, if you wanted to add some of the spritz to this, you could certainly do that. Again, it won't impact anything with any of the stamping that we've done or anything at all, because there's not enough spray in here. Like, you're not going to spray enough of it to do that. So yeah, let's just do that while we're talking about it. So I'll just make sure that's shaken up real good, all mixed in. Should be okay if you've just used it recently, but if not, just give it a good shakeroo. And I'm just going to kind of hold it back and just give it a light little mist here and there. So get a few little splatters, but yeah, that looks good. And I'll give that a quick dry. And, you know, also too, like if you just wanted to add some splatters, like with like a mica stain, you could certainly do that as well. I wouldn't recommend, as before, I wouldn't recommend spraying over the background with the mica stain, because that will definitely cover over any of what you've got on your background. It's just a much more opaque spray, so it's meant to give more coverage than the spritz. And so then just, you know, adhere down your die cuts. And I'm going to trim this one down as well and mount it onto a piece of black cardstock, and then that will be finished. And then one final step here before I finish off the card is just going to ink the edges here a little bit with some of the walnut stained stress ink. And then I'll just adhere that to a piece of black cardstock and be ready to go. I hope you enjoyed these 2 vintage grungy Christmas cards and learned some tips for mass producing your holiday cards this season. Remember, you can use compartmental making to batch any of your card making projects. It's a total game changer when you need multiples. If you want even more inspiration for making multiples, be sure to check out my Mass Producing Christmas Card Series playlist. I've got tons of card ideas perfect for compartmental making from past videos. You can find links to all the products I use in the description box below, along with a visual supply list for quick reference. If you enjoyed this video, I'd love it if you gave it a thumbs up and subscribed for more crafty inspiration, tips, and techniques. And don't forget to hit that notification bell so you never miss a video. And I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Are you planning to mass produce your cards this year, or do you prefer making one-of-a-kind designs? Until next time, stay crafty, my friend.